November 1944. A muddy, churned-up crossroads south of Metz, France. An American infantryman lies in the freezing muck, his legs soaked in dark, spreading crimson, his makeshift tourniquet failing as he watches 3 empty ambulances crawl past him without slowing down. The air is thick with the scent of diesel and wet earth, but the only sound he hears is the roar of engines moving away from his pain. He has been waiting for 2 hours, drifting in and out of consciousness, while the dispatcher at the aid station consults a color-coded clipboard and waves the vehicles onward. This soldier is about to lose a limb, not to the German shrapnel that tore into him, but to the rigid, cold indifference of a man who values a schedule over a human life. George Patton is coming, and the calendar is about to be burned. This is the story of what Patton did when an ambulance dispatcher let a soldier bleed because it was the wrong day. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when old hierarchies met new realities. Private First Class Clarence Odom was 23 years old, born and raised in the humid, pine-shadowed outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia. He enlisted in the early days of the war, driven by a quiet resolve to see his country through its darkest hour and prove his worth on the front lines. A man of few words and steady hands, he had served with distinction in his infantry unit, earning the respect of his squad through a calm demeanor under fire. During a brutal patrol near the front, he had thrown himself into the path of incoming rounds to drag his squad leader to safety, absorbing shrapnel that tore through his lower leg. Now, he lay in the freezing mud of a roadside aid station, his life fading as he watched the very people tasked with saving him choose to ignore his cries because of a bureaucratic line drawn in the dirt. Sergeant First Class Howard Briggs, 38, hailed from the strict, segregated streets of Birmingham, Alabama, and carried his prejudices like a badge of office. He was the man in charge of ambulance dispatch, a position he wielded with the cold efficiency of a ledger clerk who had forgotten he was dealing with human lives. His ideology was simple and toxic, rooted in the belief that the Army was a machine of order, and order meant keeping the races strictly partitioned at every level of support. He took an unsettling pride in his clipboard, where he meticulously tracked the schedules for white and colored ambulances, ensuring that their paths never crossed. His uniform was always pressed, his boots polished to a blinding shine, and he guarded his schedule with a fanatical intensity, often stating that if he broke his rigid rules for a single soul, the entire structure of the Army would inevitably collapse into chaos. By November 1944, the Third Army was pushing hard across the rain-soaked plains of eastern France, closing in on the German border. The landscape was a grim stretch of churned mud, broken hedgerows, and shattered villages. Every mile gained came at a staggering cost in lives, equipment, and precious medical resources. The logistics of the Allied advance were stretched to the breaking point. Supplies were thin, vehicles were failing, and the pressure on the medical chain was immense. In the chaos of the front, command structures often devolved into localized fiefdoms, where mid-level officers operated with near-total autonomy. The segregated nature of the military had become a logistical nightmare that mirrored the social fractures of the time. While soldiers of every background fought and died in the same fields, the rear echelon support was governed by strict, often nonsensical rules of separation. This was not a matter of military necessity or tactical efficiency, but a persistent, deep-seated refusal to integrate even the most basic life-saving operations. Many officers chose to look the other way, accepting these inefficiencies as an unfortunate, permanent feature of the war. They treated the artificial divides not as an obstacle to victory, but as an unbreakable law of the organization. The rigid adherence to these policies meant that soldiers were often left to linger in the cold or bleed out at the side of the road simply because they were not the right color for the ambulance currently idling at the station. This systemic failure was an open secret, tolerated by those who feared the friction of changing the status quo more than they valued the lives of the men under their command. It was within this climate of cold, bureaucratic neglect that a wounded infantryman was left to wait at a muddy crossroads south of Metz, watching empty ambulances pass by as the afternoon light began to fade. "Captain, we have a man here with a severe leg wound that needs immediate transport to the field hospital," Lieutenant Miller said, stepping into the dispatch office with a hurried, urgent stride. "That's not happening today, Lieutenant," Sergeant Briggs replied without looking up from his clipboard, his voice flat and devoid of concern. "What do you mean, it's not happening? He's lost a dangerous amount of blood, and his tourniquet is failing." Briggs finally looked up, his expression hardening as he gestured toward the charts pinned to the wall. "I mean that colored ambulances run on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Today is Wednesday. He waits until tomorrow. This is a combat casualty, Sergeant, not a parcel on a train," Miller snapped, his face reddening. "The regulation states that medical priority is dictated by the severity of the wound, not by the color of the man's skin. My clipboard says otherwise," Briggs said, tapping the paper with a steady finger. "If I start making exceptions for every wounded man who shows up on the wrong day, the whole system will fall apart. I have a schedule, and I intend to keep it." "You are choosing to let a man die because of a calendar," Miller said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "You are not a clerk. You are a soldier. Do your job and call an ambulance." "I am doing my job, Lieutenant. I am maintaining order," Briggs countered, leaning back in his chair with a sneer. "You want to move him. You find a white ambulance that has an empty seat, but it won't be coming from my dispatch. My rules are clear, and they apply to everyone, regardless of their condition." Miller stared at the man, seeing the absolute, unyielding arrogance etched into every line of his face. "You will answer for this," Miller said, turning on his heel. "Report me if you like," Briggs called out after him. "But until the orders change, the schedule stands." Miller walked out of the tent and immediately sought out his superior officer. The report reached Patton within the hour. A roar of engines signaled his arrival, and within minutes, a dust-covered jeep screeched to a halt outside the aid station. General George S. Patton stepped out, his tall frame cutting a sharp silhouette against the gray, overcast sky. His helmet, adorned with 4 polished silver stars, gleamed despite the grit of the campaign, and his ivory-handled revolvers hung heavy at his hips. The room went deathly silent. Every man froze. Officers scrambled to attention, their movements stiff and unpracticed in the sudden weight of his presence. Patton did not shout. He did not bluster. He simply walked to the center of the room, his eyes scanning the space with a cold, piercing intensity before settling squarely on the sergeant behind the desk. Patton approached the desk, his voice dropping to a low, measured tone that carried across the hushed room. He looked down at the clipboard, lying open on the wood. He asked if this was the official schedule for medical evacuations. Briggs, visibly trembling but still clinging to his arrogance, confirmed it was, claiming it was necessary for maintaining order in a chaotic sector. Patton asked if he was aware that a man had been bleeding out on the roadside for 2 hours because of the calendar pinned to the wall. Briggs stammered a defense about systemic regulations. Patton asked him one final time to tell him, in his own words, why a man's life was worth less than a piece of paper. Briggs stumbled, unable to speak, the cold reality of his own words finally catching up to him. Patton remained still, his gaze fixed on the sergeant. He began to speak, his voice hard, precise, and devoid of any doubt. He dismantled the logic of the schedule piece by piece, noting that an army operating on the whims of a calendar was not an army, but a failure of leadership. He reminded the room that the only thing that mattered in his sector was the physical condition of the men in the mud. He looked at the wounded soldier, still visible through the tent flap, and then back to the man who had let him suffer. The contrast was absolute. The sergeant had sought to divide, to categorize, and to exclude, while the mission required only one thing: to save the soldiers who had risked everything for the line. Patton made his decision clear. He told the sergeant he had 2 choices. He could either admit the total failure of his own pride, or he could spend the next month living the consequences of his logic. There was no third option. The system of exclusion was dead. The priority for every ambulance from this moment forward was simple. The most critically wounded man was loaded first, every single time, regardless of who he was or where he came from. He demanded the sergeant's response. The air in the tent grew thin. Briggs, his face drained of color, could do nothing but nod in silent, terrified submission. He had no defense left. Patton's word was absolute. Patton snapped his fingers, and two of his personal aides stepped forward, flanking the sergeant. Under the general's unwavering watch, they tore the color-coded schedule from the clipboard and shredded it into the mud. Patton then ordered the sergeant to be stripped of his dispatch duties immediately. He signaled to the waiting medical team to bring up an ambulance, not the one reserved for the sergeant's arbitrary schedule, but the first one available at the site. The sergeant was forced to watch as the medics loaded Private Odom, treating him with the urgency that had been denied to him for hours. As the ambulance doors slammed shut, the sergeant was shoved into the back of a canvas-covered transport vehicle. Patton leaned close, his voice cold and final. He informed the sergeant that for the next 30 days, he would ride in every ambulance in the Third Army, serving as the first man to be unceremoniously dumped at every stop to ensure that the most critically wounded soldier always took his place. The witnesses, a mix of shell-shocked infantry and stunned medics, watched in silence as the sergeant was driven away, his authority and his schedule permanently discarded in the dirt. Clarence Odom spent the remainder of his life back in the suburbs of Atlanta. After his medical discharge, he underwent extensive rehabilitation and learned to walk with a prosthetic, though the phantom pain in his severed limb never fully left him. He found work as a vocational instructor, teaching mechanics to young men in his community, and passed away in 1994, surrounded by a family who knew him as a man of quiet, ironclad integrity. He never spoke much of the war, but he kept his old service dog tags in a small wooden box on his nightstand until his final day. Sergeant Howard Briggs did not fare as well once the war ended. Following his immediate removal from dispatch, he spent the closing months of the conflict in a series of grueling, low-level logistical assignments that stripped him of the command he had held so dear. He was returned to civilian life in 1946, eventually settling into a bitter, solitary existence in Birmingham. He held a string of menial jobs, finding the new post-war order impossible to navigate without his old structures of control, and died in 1968, largely forgotten by the Army he had once tried to shape in his own narrow image. General George S. Patton, true to his nature, never made a public mention of the incident in his memoirs or official reports. He held a deep contempt for the waste of human potential and viewed the ambulance dispatch scandal as nothing more than a tactical failure that required a swift, corrective solution. He kept the report of the incident in a locked desk drawer at his headquarters, a silent record of one of the many small, brutal battles he waged to ensure his army remained a lethal, focused instrument of war. Some historians have argued that the incident was an inevitable friction point in an army struggling with deep-seated institutional segregation and limited resources. They contend that commanders like Patton, while decisive, were limited by the broader socio-political constraints of the era and could not single-handedly dismantle systemic prejudice. Others have argued that such moments were essential for pushing the military toward inevitable change, serving as localized sparks that eventually forced a reckoning with the inherent contradictions of a segregated force fighting for democratic ideals abroad. What is certain is that the single priority system imposed on that rainy afternoon in France became the standard procedure for all ambulance dispatchers in the Third Army, ensuring that medical care was finally determined by a soldier's need, rather than the date on a calendar. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have chosen a softer alternative? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the moments that forced people to face what they'd done, make sure to subscribe.